The candle on the writing desk had burned down to almost nothing when Eliza Hartley heard the carriage wheels crush against the gravel outside, and her hands went still over the letter she had been folding. It was past midnight. No guest arrived at Ashcombe Manor past midnight, unless something had gone terribly wrong. She rose from the small chair in her narrow room at the top of the house, crossed to the window, and looked down. A single black carriage stood in the drive, its lamps throwing long yellow light across the wet stones. A man stepped down from it, tall, dressed in a dark coat, and though she could not see his face clearly from that height, something in the way the household staff scrambled toward him told her this was no ordinary visitor. Eliza had lived in this house for 6 years, ever since her parents had died, and left her with nothing but a trunk of clothes, and a set of manners too fine for a servant, and too poor for a lady. Lord Edmund Ashcombe had taken her in as a companion to his wife, and in exchange she had learned the first and most important rule of her position. A woman in her place did not speak unless she was spoken to, and even then, she measured every word before it left her mouth. She had broken that rule only once, 3 years ago, and the memory of what followed still made her chest tighten. She was not going to make that mistake again. So she dressed quickly, smoothed her hair, and went down the back stairs to find out what the commotion was about, keeping her face calm and her opinions locked behind her teeth. By the time she reached the lower hall, Lady Constance Ashcombe was already awake, wrapped in a shawl, her voice sharp with alarm. "Get the good rooms ready, all of them, and wake Clara. She must be presentable within the hour." "My lady, who has arrived?" Eliza asked, careful to keep her tone soft. Lady Constance turned to her, as though noticing her for the first time. "The Duke of Ravenwood. He was meant to arrive tomorrow with proper notice, but it seems he has decided to surprise us instead." Her eyes narrowed, the way they always did when she was calculating something. "This changes everything, Eliza. Everything depends on the next 3 days." Eliza did not yet understand what she meant by everything, but she would soon learn that the family's entire future rested on the goodwill of the man now stepping through their front door, and that the price of failure would fall heaviest not on Lord Ashcombe, who owned the house, nor on Lady Constance, who ruled it, but on the people with the least power to protect themselves. She learned the full truth of the danger only an hour later, when she brought a tray of tea to Lord Ashcombe's study and found him pacing before the fire, a letter crushed in his fist. "Sit down, girl." "No, stand. It does not matter," he said, and Eliza realized with a small shock that he was speaking to her as though she were someone worth confiding in, which had never happened before. "The estate is drowning in debt. You understand nothing of business, but I will tell you plainly, because I need every servant in this house, alert and careful over these next days. If the Duke does not agree to the marriage between his nephew and our Clara, we lose this house. We lose everything. Do you understand what that means for people like you?" She understood perfectly. It meant that if the Ashcombe family fell, she would have nowhere to go. No family, no fortune, no protector. She would be turned out onto roads she did not know, with a trunk of fine clothes and no fine future waiting for her. "I understand, my lord," she said quietly. "Then keep your head down and your mouth shut for 3 days, and perhaps we will all still have a roof over our heads by the end of the week." It was, in its own way, the same instruction she had received since the day she arrived at Ashcombe Manor, except now it carried teeth. Silence was no longer simply good manners. It was survival. The next morning, the household woke to the kind of frantic energy that comes before a storm. Maids polished silver that had already been polished the week before. Lady Constance rehearsed conversation topics with her daughter Clara, as though drilling a soldier before battle, correcting the angle of her chin, the pitch of her laugh, the exact number of seconds she should allow before answering a compliment. Lord Ashcombe locked himself away with his account books, muttering figures under his breath that made his face go pale. Eliza's task, as always, was to remain useful and invisible. She arranged flowers, she checked linens, she carried messages between rooms, and every so often, she caught a glimpse of the Duke through a doorway or across a garden path, and each time, something about him unsettled the picture she had built in her mind of powerful men. She had expected arrogance, the kind worn like a coat by every wealthy man who had ever visited this house. Instead, she saw a man who listened more than he spoke, who thanked the footman who opened the door for him, who paused in the garden to ask the name of a flower from the gardener himself, rather than simply admiring it and moving on. It was such a small thing, and yet it struck her as strange, almost dangerous, because it did not fit the shape of the world she had learned to survive in. That evening, she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had gone to the small sitting room to collect a shawl Lady Constance had left behind, and she found the door left slightly open, voices drifting through the gap. Lady Constance was speaking to her sister, Aunt Priscilla, who had arrived earlier that day to help oversee the visit. "He is not a fool, Priscilla. Everyone says the Duke sees through flattery in an instant. If Clara performs too perfectly, he will smell the rehearsal on her like perfume. We must be careful." "Then what do you suggest? Let the girl stumble and ruin us?" "No. I suggest we give him something real to observe. Something unpolished. People trust what looks true, even when it is arranged to look that way." Lady Constance's voice dropped lower, and Eliza had to lean closer to hear the rest. "The companion, Eliza. She has sharp opinions when she forgets herself, and the Duke has shown he values plain speech over performance. If she is present at dinner and offers some small remark that seems unrehearsed, it may soften him toward the family, make us appear a house of honest people rather than desperate ones." Eliza's blood went cold as she stood frozen behind the door. She was not being invited to dinner as a person. She was being placed there as a prop, a piece of stage dressing meant to create an illusion of honesty, while the real performance continued around her. "And if she says something we do not want said?" Aunt Priscilla asked. "She won't. She knows her place better than anyone in this house. She has learned that lesson already, and learned it well." Lady Constance's tone carried something almost like satisfaction, as though Eliza's years of careful silence were a tool she had forged herself, rather than a wound Eliza had been forced to carry. Eliza backed away from the door before she could be discovered, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard through the walls. She returned to her room that night, with the shawl still in her hands, having forgotten entirely why she had gone to fetch it. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at the wall, turning over what she had heard. She was to be used, arranged like a piece of furniture, meant to catch the light just so, expected to remain silent, unless silence itself might fail to convince, in which case, she would be permitted exactly enough voice to serve the family's purpose, and not one word more. It was not the first time she had been treated as something less than a person in this house, but it was the first time she understood so clearly the exact shape of the trap being built around her, and the first time she felt something other than resignation rise up in her chest. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to read before she could properly walk, who had told her that a mind sharp enough to see the truth was worth more than any title. She thought of her father, a man of modest means but firm principles, who had never once told her to make herself smaller for the comfort of others. She wondered, not for the first time, what they would think of the woman she had become in this house, folding herself into corners, swallowing her thoughts like medicine. The dinner was set for the following evening. Word had spread through the staff quarters that this was no ordinary meal but a decision point, that the future of the estate, and every person who depended on it, would be shaped by what happened at that table. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper who had always shown Eliza a rough sort of kindness, found her in the linen room the next afternoon, and studied her face with concern. "You look as though you have swallowed a stone, child. What troubles you?" Eliza hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Nothing that can be helped, Mrs. Whitfield. I am only tired. Tired eyes, I have seen plenty of in this house. This is something else." The older woman set down the linens she carried, and lowered her voice. "I have served this family for 20 years, and I have watched what they do to people who are useful to them. Whatever it is they want from you tomorrow night, guard yourself. A person can be spent like a coin, if they are not careful, and once spent, no one troubles to replace what was taken." The words settled into Eliza, like seeds pressed into soil, and though she said nothing more, she carried them with her through the rest of the day, as she prepared the dining hall for the following evening, polishing silver she had already polished, folding napkins into shapes meant to impress a man she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in her entire life. That night, unable to sleep, she took out the small collection of books she had saved from her parents' modest library, books that had traveled with her from her old life into this one, like fragile proof that she had once belonged somewhere she was valued for more than her usefulness. She read by candlelight until her eyes grew heavy, And somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, she made a decision she did not yet have words for. A small, hard resolve settling in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Whatever happened at that table tomorrow, she would not disappear into it entirely. She might have to stay silent. She might have no choice but to play the part assigned to her. But she would not let herself become nothing more than an arrangement of flowers meant to please a stranger's eye. The morning of the dinner arrived gray and heavy with clouds that threatened rain, as though the sky itself understood the weight pressing down on Ashcombe Manor. Servants moved through the halls with quick, careful steps. Lady Constance inspected every room twice. Clara practiced her laugh in the mirror until her mother declared it acceptable. Lord Ashcombe locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy he did not usually touch before evening. And Eliza, dressed in the plain gray gown she always wore for formal occasions, pinned her hair with hands that trembled only slightly, and walked down the stairs toward a dinner that everyone in the house believed they understood the shape of, never suspecting how completely the evening was about to break apart every careful plan they had built. The dining hall at Ashcombe Manor had never looked so carefully arranged, and yet the moment Eliza stepped through the doorway, she sensed that something beneath the surface had already begun to shift, like ice cracking under weight no one could see. The long table gleamed with silver that had been polished twice, candles burning in tall holders down its center, casting warm light across faces that did their best to appear relaxed, while every muscle beneath the fine clothing stood rigid with tension. Lord Edmund Ashcombe sat at the head of the table, his smile stretched thin. Lady Constance sat beside him, her posture so perfect it looked painful. Clara, dressed in pale blue silk that had cost more than most families in the county earned in a year, sat across from the empty chair reserved for their guest, practicing the exact expression her mother had rehearsed with her, a smile that showed just enough teeth to seem warm without seeming eager. Aunt Priscilla occupied the seat nearest the door, positioned there deliberately, Eliza suspected, so she could watch the room like a general surveying a battlefield, and near the far end of the table, in the place assigned to companions and dependents, sat Eliza herself, folded into her chair, as small as her body would allow, hands in her lap, eyes lowered in the posture she had perfected over 6 long years. The Duke of Ravenwood entered a few minutes later, and the room seemed to hold its breath as one. He was younger than Eliza had expected from the way the household staff spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones, though there was something in his bearing that suggested a man who had seen far more of the world than his years might indicate. He greeted Lord Ashcombe with a firm handshake, bowed to Lady Constance with proper courtesy, and turned to Clara with a polite nod that gave away nothing at all of his opinion. "Your Grace, we are honored beyond words that you chose to grace our home," Lady Constance said, her voice smooth as poured cream. "I do hope the accommodations were satisfactory, given the sudden nature of your arrival." "They were more than satisfactory, Lady Ashcombe. I apologize again for the lack of notice. My business in the north concluded sooner than expected, and I found myself eager to see this part of the country before returning to the capital." His eyes moved briefly around the table, resting for the briefest moment on each face, and Eliza felt an odd shiver when his gaze passed over her, though it did not linger. The first course arrived, and with it, the careful dance of conversation that Eliza had witnessed so many times in this house, though never with stakes so high pressing down on every word. Lady Constance guided the discussion toward Clara's accomplishments, her skill at the pianoforte, her fluency in French, her charitable work among the poor of the parish, each fact offered like a gift wrapped in silk paper, designed to be admired rather than examined too closely. The Duke listened with polite attention, asking a question here and there, but Eliza noticed something the others seemed to miss in their eagerness to impress him. His questions were never about the accomplishments themselves. He did not ask which composers Clara preferred, or how many charitable visits she had made that month. Instead, he asked why. Why had she chosen the pianoforte over other instruments? What had drawn her to visit the poor, rather than simply sending assistance through others? And each time, Clara's rehearsed confidence faltered just slightly, as though the questions required a kind of thinking she had not prepared for. "I suppose I have always loved music," Clara offered after a pause that lasted a beat too long. "It seems the natural choice for a young lady of good family." "The natural choice," the Duke repeated, and something in his tone made Lady Constance's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. "I have found that very little in life is truly natural, Miss Ashcombe. Most of what we call natural is simply what we have been taught to want. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against fine porcelain. Eliza kept her eyes on her plate, though she could not stop herself from turning his words over in her mind, recognizing in them a kind of honesty that unsettled the entire performance being staged around this table. Lord Ashcombe cleared his throat and steered the conversation towards safer waters, discussing the harvest, the state of the roads, the recent improvements to the local church. The Duke engaged with polite interest, but Eliza noticed his attention drifting more than once toward the far end of the table, toward the corner where she sat in careful, practiced silence. It happened first during the second course, when a servant stumbled slightly while pouring wine, and a few drops spilled across the white tablecloth near Clara's place. Lady Constance's face flickered with barely controlled irritation before she smoothed it away, murmuring something about how these things happened and no harm was done. Clara laughed, a bright, brittle sound that did not match the moment at all, and dabbed at the small stain with her napkin, as though it were the greatest misfortune of the evening. The Duke watched this small scene unfold with an expression Eliza could not quite read, something between curiosity and quiet disappointment, and for the briefest instant, his eyes flicked toward Eliza again, as though checking her reaction to the same small drama. She kept her face perfectly still, though inside she felt a strange, uncomfortable awareness that she was being observed not as furniture, as Lady Constance had intended, but as a person whose opinion might actually matter to the man holding their future in his hands. Aunt Priscilla, sensing the conversation had gone quiet for too long, launched into a story about a mutual acquaintance in London, weaving in mentions of titles and connections with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades building and maintaining exactly this kind of social architecture. The Duke listened politely, though Eliza thought she saw the faintest flicker of weariness cross his features, quickly hidden behind good manners. It was during a lull in this story, while servants cleared the second course and prepared the third, that something happened which Eliza would later understand as the first true crack in the evening's careful design. Margaret, one of the upper housemaids who had been assigned to assist with serving that evening due to the importance of the occasion, approached the table to refill a water glass and, in doing so, let slip a comment meant only for the ear of another servant, but pitched slightly too loud in her nervousness. They say his own mother arranged 3 matches for him before, and each one fell through, because he refused to be told who to love, she whispered, not realizing how far her voice carried in the sudden quiet of the room. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water, rippling outward, before anyone could stop them. Lady Constance's face went pale with fury and mortification. Clara's rehearsed smile crumbled for just a moment before she forced it back into place. Lord Ashcombe's hand tightened around his wineglass, hard enough that Eliza feared it might shatter. The Duke, however, did something none of them expected. He laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that broke through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "It seems my reputation precedes me, even into rooms I have never visited before," he said, and there was no anger in his voice at all, only a kind of rueful amusement. "The rumor has the essential truth of it, though the details have grown more dramatic with each telling, as rumors always do. I have indeed declined matches arranged on my behalf, and I suspect I will continue to do so until I find a reason not to." "Your Grace is entirely within his rights to choose his own path," Lady Constance said quickly, though her voice carried a brittle edge that suggested she was already calculating how much damage the maid's careless words had done to the evening's careful plan. "Margaret, you may leave us. Now." The maid fled the room with her face burning red, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the table once more, thick enough that Eliza could feel it pressing against her skin, like a physical weight. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in her lap, though her mind raced with the awareness that the evening had already begun to slip away from the script Lady Constance had written for it. "I do not fault the girl for speaking honestly," the Duke said after a moment, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the table. "In my experience, honest words spoken out of turn do far less damage than careful words designed to hide the truth. I have sat through a great many dinners in my life, Lady Ashcombe, where every sentence was measured and weighed before it left anyone's mouth, and I confess, I have grown weary of them." Lady Constance's expression flickered, caught between the desire to agree with a man whose favor she desperately needed, and the fear that agreeing might expose the very performance she had built this evening around. Then perhaps your grace would prefer more relaxed conversation, she offered carefully. We are, after all, a simple country family, not accustomed to the sophistication of London gatherings. Simple country families interest me far more than sophisticated London gatherings, Lady Ashcombe. I find that people say far more true things when they believe themselves to be simple. His gaze moved slowly around the table once more, and this time, it did not slide past Eliza, but settled on her directly, holding there for a moment that felt far longer than it likely was. Which brings me to a question I have been curious about since I arrived at this table. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her face carefully neutral, unaware yet that the next words out of his mouth would shatter every careful arrangement Lady Constance had built, and place Eliza directly at the center of a night she had been promised would require nothing more of her than silence. I could not help but notice, the Duke continued, setting down his wineglass with deliberate slowness, that everyone at this table has spoken this evening, except one person, who has sat so quietly and so carefully that I find myself far more curious about her thoughts than about anything else that has been said tonight. The silence that followed was absolute, and Eliza felt every eye at the table turn toward her at once, the weight of their combined attention pressing down on her like a hand closing around her throat. For a moment, no one at the table moved, and the silence stretched so long that Eliza could hear the faint crackle of the candles burning in their holders, and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows. Lady Constance recovered first, her laugh brittle and quick, the sound of someone trying to close a door before something unwanted could slip through it. Your Grace is too kind to notice our companion at all. Eliza is a quiet girl by nature, of little interest at a table such as this. Perhaps we might return to the topic of the County Assembly next month, which I understand your Grace may attend. I am certain the Assembly is a fascinating subject, the Duke said, his tone perfectly pleasant, though there was something underneath it, a thread of steel that had not been there a moment before. But I find I am not yet finished with my curiosity, Lady Ashcombe. You said she is a companion. To whom? To myself, your Grace. She assists with correspondence, with the household accounts, small tasks of that nature. Lady Constance's hands, folded on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. And has she been with your family long? 6 years now, I believe. 6 years, the Duke repeated, and he turned his attention back to Eliza with an expression that seemed genuinely curious rather than cruel, though the effect on the rest of the table was much the same as if he had drawn a blade across the tablecloth. 6 years is a long time to sit at a table and never once be asked what you think of anything. I find myself wondering what a person learns to see, sitting quietly for 6 years while others speak. Clara shifted in her seat, her earlier rehearsed poise cracking further at the edges. Your Grace, surely there are more interesting matters to discuss than the observations of a companion. I could tell you about the improvements my father has made to the tenant cottages this year, if it would please you. It would please me a great deal to hear Miss Hartley's thoughts first, the Duke said, and though his voice remained gentle, there was a finality to it that closed off any further attempt to redirect the conversation. He turned fully toward Eliza now, his gray eyes steady and searching, though not unkind. Miss Hartley, I understand you may have been taught that your opinions are not wanted at this table. I am telling you now, plainly, that I want them. I have sat through this entire meal listening to careful words arranged like flowers in a vase, and I find myself in want of something true. You have watched this family, this house, this evening, from a vantage point none of the rest of us occupy. I would very much like to know what you have seen. Eliza's heart pounded so hard, she was certain the sound of it must be audible to everyone at the table. She felt Lady Constance's gaze burning into the side of her face, a silent warning sharper than any words could have carried. She felt Lord Ashcombe's stillness, the particular quality of a man holding his breath, while watching his entire fortune balance on the edge of a single moment. She felt Clara's barely concealed panic, and Aunt Priscilla's calculating stillness, waiting to see which way the evening would break. And beneath all of it, she felt something else stirring in her own chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not fear, though fear was certainly present. Something closer to the resolve that had settled into her the night before, reading by candlelight, remembering her mother's voice telling her that a mind sharp enough to see the truth was worth more than any title. Your Grace, Lady Constance said quickly, before Eliza could speak, I must insist that we not burden Eliza with questions she is not accustomed to answering. It would be unkind to place her in such a position." "Unkind," the Duke repeated, and for the first time that evening, something like genuine displeasure flickered across his composed features. "Forgive me, Lady Ashcombe, but I have observed something troubling this evening that I believe deserves to be named plainly, rather than danced around with polite words. In the space of this single meal, I have watched a young woman corrected for a natural laugh, a servant dismissed for an honest observation, and now a companion silenced, before she has even had the chance to speak a single word. If this is the ordinary practice of this household, then I confess it tells me a great deal more about the character of this family than any amount of rehearsed conversation about pianofortes and charitable visits." The words landed like a blow, and Eliza watched the color drain from Lady Constance's face, watched Lord Ashcombe's jaw tighten with the particular anger of a man forced to sit silent while his authority was questioned in his own home, watched Clara's eyes fill with the beginning of tears she was too well trained to let fall in front of company. "I did not mean to suggest," the Duke continued, his tone softening slightly as he seemed to register the tension he had created, "that this family is unkind by nature, only that I have spent a great many evenings in houses that valued performance over honesty, and I find myself unwilling to spend this one the same way. I am asking Miss Hartley a simple question, and I would consider it a kindness to me, personally, if she were permitted to answer it in her own words, without correction or interruption from anyone else at this table." He turned back to Eliza, and his expression gentled further, as though he understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the room, exactly what he was asking of her, and exactly what it might cost her once the meal ended, and the doors closed, and the ordinary rules of the house reasserted themselves. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "you need not fear speaking honestly at this table tonight. I give you my word that no harm will come to you, for anything you choose to say in this room, so long as I am present in this house." It was a remarkable thing to promise, and Eliza understood immediately that it carried real weight, that a man of his position and reputation would not offer such a guarantee lightly, nor break it easily once given. But she understood also, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her stomach, that his protection extended only as far as this room and this evening. Tomorrow, when the carriage carried him away down the drive, she would still be Eliza Hartley, companion and dependent, living under Lady Constance's roof and subject to Lady Constance's judgment. She looked, for just a moment, toward Lady Constance, and what she saw there was not simply anger, but something closer to desperation. The look of a woman who understood that everything she had built this evening to secure her family's future was now unraveling in front of a man whose good opinion could not be bought back with careful words. And beneath that desperation, buried but visible if one knew where to look, Eliza saw something else. Fear. Not merely fear of losing the marriage arrangement or the estate, but a deeper fear. The fear of a woman who had spent years constructing a particular version of her household and her family. A version that depended entirely on certain truths never being spoken aloud. Eliza thought suddenly of the letter she had been folding the night before, the one she had set aside when she heard the carriage arrive. A letter addressed to a solicitor in London that Lady Constance had asked her to write, and had been very particular about the wording of. A letter that touched on matters of the estate's finances, that did not entirely match the figures Lord Ashcombe kept in his account books. She had thought nothing of the discrepancy at the time, dismissing it as simply another detail of household business she was not meant to fully understand. But sitting there now, feeling the full weight of Lady Constance's desperate gaze, she began to wonder whether the evening's careful performance had been built not simply to secure Clara's marriage, but to hide something else entirely, something that made honest conversation at this table far more dangerous than Lady Constance had ever let on. The Duke waited, patient and steady, his eyes never leaving her face, and the rain outside grew heavier against the windows, and somewhere down the hall, a clock struck the hour, with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged silence of the room. "Miss Hartley," he said again, softer this time, almost gentle, "will you tell me what you have seen tonight?" Eliza's mind moved faster in that moment than it had in years, weighing every possible answer against every possible consequence, the way a person standing at the edge of deep water measures the distance before deciding whether to dive. If she stayed silent, if she murmured some soft apology, and deferred to Lady Constance's wishes, the evening would likely settle back into its careful shape, and she would remain safe within the narrow, familiar boundaries of her position. She would go on being useful and invisible, folding herself into corners for however many more years fate allowed her in this house. If she spoke honestly, she risked everything. Lady Constance's fury would not fade with the Duke's departure. It would follow Eliza through every remaining day she spent under this roof, in small cruelties and cold silences, in the particular punishments available to a woman who held complete power over another's food, shelter, and future. But she thought again of her mother's voice, of the books she had read the night before by candlelight, of Mrs. Whitfield's warning that a person could be spent like a coin if they were not careful. She thought of 6 years spent making herself smaller, and of the strange, uncomfortable relief she had felt earlier that evening, when the Duke's eyes had passed over her and, for one unguarded moment, seemed to actually see her. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, though she felt her hands trembling in her lap where no one could see them. "I have seen a family that loves each other, in its own way, and fears losing what it has built. I do not think that fear makes them cruel by nature, only careful in ways that sometimes look like cruelty to someone watching from outside." It was a careful answer, honest but incomplete, testing the boundaries of what she had been promised before committing to anything further. The Duke's expression did not change, though she thought she saw a flicker of something like approval in his eyes. "Go on," he said simply. Lady Constance's hand moved slightly on the table, as though she meant to reach out and stop whatever came next, through sheer force of will. But she caught herself, aware perhaps that any further interruption would only confirm exactly the kind of household the Duke already suspected he had walked into. "I have also seen," Eliza continued, choosing her words with the care of someone walking across thin ice, testing each step before trusting it with her full weight, "that this family measures its worth by what others think of it, more than perhaps it needs to. Miss Ashcombe is a kind young woman, with a genuine gift for music, but she has been taught to perform her gifts for approval rather than enjoy them for herself, and I think that troubles her more than she is permitted to say." Clara's face went scarlet, and for a moment, Eliza feared she had gone too far, had wounded a girl who had done nothing to deserve public exposure of her private unhappiness. But when she glanced toward Clara, she saw not anger in the young woman's eyes, but something startled and almost grateful, as though someone had finally named a truth she had never been given permission to speak aloud herself. "That is remarkably perceptive," the Duke said quietly. "And what else have you seen, Miss Hartley?" Eliza hesitated. The next observation sat heavier in her chest than the others, closer to the discrepancy she had noticed in Lady Constance's letter the night before, closer to matters she suspected the family would prefer remained buried beneath polite conversation about pianofortes and tenant cottages. She glanced once more at Lady Constance and saw, beneath the fury, that same flicker of fear she had noticed earlier, and she understood, in that instant, that whatever secret lay beneath tonight's careful performance, it was large enough that Lady Constance feared it more than she feared the Duke's displeasure. "I have seen," Eliza said slowly, "that everyone at this table tonight has been asked to play a part, myself included, and that the strain of playing those parts convincingly has left very little room for anyone to simply be themselves. I think if this family were given the chance to stop performing, even for one evening, they might discover they have less to fear from honesty than they believe." It was, she realized even as she said it, as much a message to herself as an answer to the Duke's question, and she felt something shift in her chest as the words left her mouth, a small, unfamiliar loosening, as though a fist she had been clenching for 6 years had finally begun, just slightly, to open. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and the silence that followed felt different from the silence before, less charged with danger, and more filled with something like genuine consideration. "Thank you, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "That is precisely the kind of honesty I had hoped to find at this table tonight, and precisely the kind I so rarely encounter." Lady Constance seized the opening the moment it appeared. "Your Grace is generous to indulge Eliza's observations, but I hope your Grace understands. They reflect only her own limited perspective, formed from a position that allows her to see very little of the true workings of this family." "On the contrary, Lady Ashcombe," the Duke replied, and his voice carried a quiet firmness that brooked no argument. I have found that those who occupy the quietest positions in a household often see the most clearly, precisely because they are never asked to perform for anyone's benefit. I have spent this entire evening being shown a carefully arranged picture of your family, and I confess, I trust Miss Hartley's unguarded words far more than I trust anything else I have been told tonight. The statement hung in the air like a verdict, and Eliza saw Lord Ashcombe's face go through several emotions in quick succession: anger, fear, and finally a kind of grim, calculating resignation, the look of a man recalculating his strategy in real time. Aunt Priscilla's eyes had narrowed to sharp points, fixed on Eliza with an expression that promised this conversation was far from finished, whatever the Duke chose to believe tonight. Clara, however, surprised everyone at the table by speaking without waiting to be prompted, her voice small but steady. "Your Grace, I think Eliza is right. I have wanted to say for some time that I would rather play music because I love it than because it might impress a guest, but I did not know how to say so without disappointing my mother." Lady Constance's mouth opened, then closed again, and for the first time that evening, Eliza saw something in her expression that looked almost like genuine surprise, as though her own daughter's honesty had struck her harder than anything the Duke had said all night. "It seems," the Duke said, and there was warmth in his voice now, the careful edge from earlier softened by something closer to satisfaction, "that this dinner has already proven more valuable than I expected, when I decided on impulse to arrive a day early. I find I am no longer interested in polite performances, Lady Ashcombe. I am interested in the people at this table who have just shown me the courage to speak honestly, even at some risk to themselves." Eliza felt the weight of his gaze settle on her once more, and though the danger of the moment had not entirely passed, she understood, with a strange, quiet clarity, that something fundamental had shifted in the room, something that would not simply fade away once the carriage carried the Duke down the drive the next morning. She had spoken. She had been heard, and whatever came next, she could not go back to being entirely invisible again. But even as that small, fragile hope took root in her chest, she caught sight of Lady Constance's hands, still folded on the table, knuckles white, and she understood that the true cost of tonight's honesty had not yet been paid, and that Lady Constance would not soon forget who had been the one to speak first, when everyone else had been trained into silence. The final course arrived in a silence that felt entirely different from the tense quiet of earlier in the evening, a silence built not from fear, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a room full of people who had, for once, stopped performing for one another. The Duke turned his attention to Lord Ashcombe with the easy manner of a man who had already gained what he wanted from the evening's conversation, and was now simply curious about the rest. "Lord Ashcombe, I understand you have made considerable improvements to the tenant cottages this year. I would be glad to hear more of it, if you are willing to share." Lord Ashcombe brightened visibly, grateful for a subject he could speak to with confidence rather than careful calculation. "Indeed, Your Grace. We replaced the roofs on the eastern row entirely, and improved the drainage that had troubled the lower fields for years. A costly undertaking, I imagine, particularly alongside the other demands of running an estate this size. Costly, yes, but necessary. A landlord who neglects his tenants neglects the very foundation of his fortune." Lord Ashcombe spoke the words with practiced conviction, the kind of statement clearly rehearsed for exactly this sort of conversation, and Eliza, watching from her seat, noticed something she suspected only she among the family members present had the vantage point to see. His hand, resting near his wineglass, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man choosing his words with far more care than his relaxed tone suggested. "And the funds for such improvements," the Duke continued, his tone still pleasant, still conversational, though Eliza sensed beneath it the same searching quality that had led him to ask about her earlier. "Did they come from the estate's ordinary income, or did you find it necessary to seek other arrangements?" The question landed softly, almost carelessly, and yet Eliza saw Lord Ashcombe's jaw tighten by the smallest fraction, saw Lady Constance's eyes flick toward her husband with an expression that was gone before anyone else could have caught it, though Eliza, trained by 6 years of careful watching, caught it easily. "The ordinary income of the estate, Your Grace, supplemented by prudent management," Lord Ashcombe said, and though his voice remained steady, Eliza recognized in the careful construction of the sentence the same quality she had noticed in the letter she had written the night before at Lady Constance's direction. A sentence built to sound complete, while revealing as little as possible. "Prudent management," the Duke repeated, and something in his tone made Eliza's stomach tighten with a feeling she could not quite name. "I confess I ask because I have heard whispers, in circles that concern themselves with such matters, that the Ashcombe estate has taken on debts in recent years considerably larger than the improvements to a handful of tenant cottages might explain. I mention this not to embarrass you, Lord Ashcombe, but because I intend to be direct about a matter that concerns any family whose future might one day be joined to my own through marriage. I would rather hear the truth from you now than discover a different truth later, when it would be far more difficult to undo whatever arrangements had already been made." The table fell utterly silent. Lady Constance's face had gone the color of old parchment, and Clara looked between her parents with an expression of dawning confusion, as though she were only now beginning to understand that the desperate energy of the past 2 days had roots far deeper and more troubling than she had been told. Eliza felt her own pulse quicken as she remembered, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, the letter she had written the night before, addressed to a solicitor in London, discussing figures that had not matched the numbers she had glimpsed once in Lord Ashcombe's account books, left open on his desk when she had delivered a tray of correspondence some weeks earlier. She had not thought much of it at the time. Now, watching Lord Ashcombe's carefully composed face begin to crack at the edges, she understood that she might be one of the very few people in this house who had seen, however briefly, the shape of whatever truth he was so desperately trying to keep hidden from the man now sitting at his table. "Your Grace speaks plainly, and I will endeavor to match that directness," Lord Ashcombe said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The estate has, in recent years, required certain loans to maintain its obligations. This is not uncommon among families of our standing, and I assure your Grace that every such arrangement has been managed with the family's long-term security firmly in mind." "I am certain it has," the Duke said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely certain at all. "I hope you will forgive my directness in raising the matter at your own table, Lord Ashcombe, but I have learned through hard experience that families eager for a marriage connection sometimes present a picture of their circumstances considerably brighter than the truth, and I have no wish to enter into any arrangement built on such foundations." Lady Constance found her voice at last, though it emerged thinner than her usual commanding tone. "Your Grace, I assure you, whatever difficulties the estate has faced are entirely ordinary and entirely manageable. Every family of consequence weathers such seasons. It would be unfortunate indeed if temporary circumstances were permitted to overshadow the genuine affection and compatibility between our children." "I do not doubt the affection," the Duke said, and his eyes moved once more, briefly, toward Eliza, as though seeking some silent confirmation of what he already suspected, though Eliza kept her face carefully still, unwilling to be drawn into a conversation that felt, suddenly, far more dangerous than anything that had come before it. But affection alone has rarely been sufficient foundation for a marriage of consequence, Lady Ashcombe, and I confess, this evening, has left me with more questions than I arrived with, rather than fewer. The dinner concluded shortly after, with polite but strained farewells exchanged as the family withdrew to the drawing room, and the Duke retired to his quarters, pleading the lateness of the hour and the fatigue of travel. Eliza helped clear the final dishes alongside the other servants, her mind turning over everything that had been said and everything that had gone carefully unsaid. Aware that whatever fragile courage she had found at that table had set something in motion that could not now be stopped. As she carried the last tray toward the kitchen, she passed the small sitting room where she had overheard Lady Constance's plans the night before, and found the door once again left slightly ajar, voices drifting through the gap in low, urgent tones. She should have walked past. She knew she should have walked past, but her feet slowed, almost against her own will, and she found herself listening once more to a conversation she was never meant to hear. "He suspects something," Lady Constance was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "That question about the loans was no idle curiosity, Edmund. Someone has spoken to him, or he has made inquiries of his own before ever arriving at our door. Then we must ensure he learns nothing further," Lord Ashcombe replied, his voice low and hard, in a way Eliza had rarely heard from him. "Whatever it costs us." "And the girl," Lady Constance added, after a pause that seemed to Eliza to stretch far too long. "Eliza," She has seen the account books before, has she not? She wrote the letter to Mr. Farrow only last night. Eliza's blood turned to ice where she stood in the darkened hallway, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. She saw nothing. She would understand the significance of, Lord Ashcombe said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words claimed. We cannot afford assumptions, Edmund. Not now. Not with him already suspicious. Lady Constance's voice dropped lower still, forcing Eliza to lean closer to the door despite every instinct warning her to leave immediately. If the Duke speaks with her again, if he asks her the wrong question at the wrong moment, everything we have built could collapse in an instant. We must find a way to ensure her silence, one way or another, before he departs tomorrow. Eliza backed away from the door as quietly as her shaking hands would allow, the tray rattling softly despite her best efforts, and hurried down the hall toward the kitchen, with her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be heard through the walls of the entire house. She had spoken honestly at that table tonight, believing the greatest danger had already passed once the Duke's promise of protection expired with the evening. She understood now, standing alone in the dark corridor, with her pulse hammering in her ears, that the true danger had only just begun, and that Lady Constance's next words, spoken in that low, urgent voice behind a barely closed door, had not sounded like the words of a woman merely concerned about appearances. They had sounded like the words of a woman already deciding what needed to be done about a servant who knew too much. Eliza did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Lady Constance's words over and over, until they seemed to echo in the darkness around her. We must find a way to ensure her silence, one way or another. She turned the phrase over in her mind, searching for some innocent interpretation, some reading that did not suggest she had become, in the space of a single evening, a danger to be managed rather than a person to be protected. She found none. Near dawn, unable to bear the confines of her room any longer, she rose, dressed quietly, and made her way down to the kitchen, hoping the familiar routine of the household's earliest hours might steady her racing thoughts. She found Mrs. Whitfield already there, as she often was before the rest of the house stirred, kneading dough at the long wooden table, with the brisk efficiency of long habit.
"You look as though you have seen a ghost, child," Mrs. Whitfield said without looking up, though her tone carried real concern beneath its bluntness.
Eliza hesitated only a moment before the words spilled out of her, quiet and urgent, the whole account of what she had overheard the night before, the letter to the solicitor, the discrepancy in the account books, Lady Constance's low, frightened voice behind the sitting-room door. Mrs. Whitfield's hands stilled on the dough as she listened, her expression growing graver with each detail. "You should not have heard any of that," Mrs. Whitfield said finally, wiping flour from her hands with a cloth, her voice low. "And having heard it, you must be very careful indeed about what you do next." "What should I do?" Eliza asked, and she heard the tremor in her own voice, the fear she had been holding back all night, finally breaking through. Mrs. Whitfield considered the question, with the seriousness it deserved. "I have served this family a long time, longer than you have been alive, and I have never once heard Lady Constance speak of ensuring anyone's silence in a manner that frightened me the way you describe. She is a proud woman, and a hard one, when her interests are threatened, but I would not have thought her capable of true harm to an innocent girl." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, with a thought Eliza could not yet read. But desperation changes people, and if the debts are as serious as the Duke's questions suggest, I cannot promise you that pride alone will govern what happens next in this house. Should I go to the Duke, tell him what I overheard? And say what, exactly? That you were listening at doors again? Gathering secrets you were never meant to hear? Mrs. Whitfield shook her head slowly. The Duke may have offered you kindness at that table last night, but kindness offered across a dinner does not always survive contact with the ordinary business of the world the next morning. If you go to him with accusations against the family that houses and feeds you, and he chooses, for whatever reason, not to believe you, or not to act, you will have made yourself an enemy of Lady Constance with nothing gained in return. Eliza understood the wisdom in this, even as it left her with no clear path forward. Then what would you have me do? Watch. Wait. Say nothing more than you already have. If the family means you no true harm, and I still hope that is the case, then your silence and your usefulness will protect you, as it always has. But if I am wrong, and you find yourself in genuine danger, come to me directly, day or night, and I will do whatever is within my power to see you safely away from this house before anything worse can happen." It was not the answer Eliza had hoped for, some clear plan that promised safety, but it was, she understood, the only honest answer available to either of them, and she found a strange, small comfort in the older woman's willingness to speak plainly, rather than offer false reassurance. She spent the morning in a state of careful watchfulness, performing her ordinary duties, while remaining alert to every shift in the household's mood. She noticed that Lady Constance avoided her eyes entirely at breakfast, addressing instructions to her in a voice colder and more clipped than usual. She noticed Lord Ashcombe's absence from the family's morning routine altogether, closeted once more in his study, and when she passed the door, she heard his voice raised in urgent conversation with someone she did not recognize, a visitor who had arrived early and been shown in quietly through the side entrance rather than the main door. Curiosity, and something closer to genuine fear for her own safety, drove her closer to the study door than caution should have allowed. She caught only fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that the visitor was a man of business, perhaps a solicitor, or an agent, representing one of the creditors, whose loans had funded the very improvements Lord Ashcombe had described so proudly at dinner the night before. "The Duke's questions have made this considerably more difficult," Lord Ashcombe was saying, his voice tight with strain. "If he begins making inquiries of his own, if he learns the full extent of what stands against this estate, the marriage arrangement will collapse entirely, and with it, any hope of resolving these debts before they become public knowledge. Then, the girl must be dealt with before the Duke has further opportunity to speak with her," the visitor replied, and Eliza's blood went cold at the words, confirming everything she had feared since overhearing Lady Constance the night before. A servant's word carries little weight against a family of your standing, but if she speaks to the Duke directly, if she confirms whatever suspicions his questions last night suggest he already holds, the damage may prove impossible to repair. "She will be sent away this very day," Lord Ashcombe said. "A distant relation in the north has long needed a companion for an elderly aunt. It will seem the most natural thing in the world for Eliza to be dispatched there on urgent family business, and by the time the Duke thinks to ask after her again, she will be far beyond his reach, and unable to say anything that might undo what we have built." Eliza pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might give away her presence through sound alone. Sent away, today. Before the Duke could speak with her again, before she could say anything more that might threaten the fragile lie the family had constructed around their finances, she thought immediately of Mrs. Whitfield's warning from that morning, of the promise she had made to come to her if genuine danger arose. But even as the thought formed, she understood there was no time left for such careful, patient plans. If Lord Ashcombe intended to send her away that very day, she would be gone from Ashcombe Manor, likely forever, before Mrs. Whitfield or anyone else who might help her even learned what had happened. She backed away from the door as quietly as she had approached it, and hurried up the back stairs toward her room, her mind racing through options that all seemed equally impossible. She could refuse to go, but a companion with no family and no fortune had no legal standing to refuse the wishes of the family that housed her. She could seek out the Duke directly, but Mrs. Whitfield's warning about the risks of such a confrontation echoed loudly in her thoughts, and she had no way of knowing whether he had already left the estate that morning, or whether he could even be found before Lord Ashcombe's plans were set irreversibly in motion. She reached her room and stood in the center of it, breathing hard, staring at the small trunk that held everything she owned in the world. The same trunk that had carried her into this house 6 years ago, and now, it seemed, would carry her back out of it before the day was through. And then, through the narrow window overlooking the front drive, she saw a figure walking slowly along the garden path below, tall, dressed in a dark coat, pausing every so often to examine some detail of the grounds with the same unhurried curiosity he had shown the day before. The Duke had not yet departed. He remained at Ashcombe Manor, at least for a few hours longer, and Eliza understood, with a clarity that steadied her trembling hands, that this might be the only chance she would ever have to determine her own fate, rather than simply accepting whatever fate others had decided for her. She moved quickly, before her courage could fail her, slipping down the back stairs and out through the servants' entrance into the cool morning air, the damp grass soaking through her thin shoes as she crossed toward the garden path, where she had seen the Duke walking only moments before. She had gone perhaps halfway across the lawn, when a voice stopped her cold. "And where might you be going in such a hurry, Eliza?" She turned, to find Aunt Priscilla standing near the terrace steps, watching her with the sharp, calculating eyes that had followed Eliza's every movement since her arrival. There was no warmth in the question, only cold suspicion, and Eliza understood at once that word of her presence outside had already reached at least one member of the family faster than she had anticipated. "I was only taking some air, Aunt Priscilla," Eliza said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "The kitchen grows close in the mornings." "Taking air in the direction of the Duke's morning walk, I see." Priscilla's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Lord Ashcombe mentioned only an hour ago that arrangements were being made for your departure to your cousin's household in the north. I confess, I find it curious that you should choose this particular morning to wander so purposefully toward our guest, rather than preparing for your journey as instructed." Eliza felt the trap closing around her, understood in an instant that Priscilla had been positioned here deliberately, watching for exactly this possibility, and that any further attempt to reach the Duke would now be reported immediately to Lord Ashcombe and Lady Constance, likely accelerating, rather than delaying whatever plans they had already set in motion for her removal. She thought of Mrs. Whitfield's advice from that morning, of the wisdom in patience and careful watching, rather than desperate action. But she thought also of the trunk waiting in her room, of the certainty that once she was carried away from this house, whatever chance she had to speak her own truth to the one person who had shown any willingness to hear it would be lost forever. "Aunt Priscilla," Eliza said, choosing her next words with the same careful deliberation she had used at the dinner table the night before, "I confess, I do not fully understand why my sudden departure has become so urgent a matter, that it must be arranged within a single day, after 6 years in this household, without any mention of such a need. I wonder if you might help me understand what has changed so quickly." It was a bold question, bolder than anything she would have dared ask a day earlier, and she saw it land on Priscilla with visible surprise, a flicker of something uncertain crossing the older woman's composed features before she recovered her sharp expression. "You presume a great deal for a companion of your station," Priscilla said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The family's decisions regarding your placement are not yours to question." "Perhaps not," Eliza replied, and she felt something steady settling into her chest, the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the dinner the night before. "But I find myself wondering whether the Duke, who showed such particular interest in honest conversation only last evening, might also find it curious that a companion who spoke a few honest words at his request should be dispatched from the household so suddenly the very next morning." The threat, veiled though it was, landed exactly where Eliza intended it to. Priscilla's face tightened, and for a long moment the two women simply looked at each other across the wet grass, each measuring the other's resolve. "You would do well to remember, girl, that you have no family name to protect you, no fortune to shield you from the consequences of overstepping your position," Priscilla said finally, her voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous than before. "The Duke's favor, such as it was, will not follow you once he departs this house, but Lady Constance's displeasure most certainly will, wherever you are sent, in whatever letters of reference or lack thereof follow you through the rest of your life." It was, Eliza understood, a genuine warning and a genuine threat, and she felt the weight of it settle heavily on her shoulders, even as she forced herself to hold her ground. Priscilla was not wrong. A single dinner's worth of honest conversation, however well received by a powerful stranger, could not undo 6 years of careful dependency, nor could it protect her from a family determined to silence any inconvenient truths before they spread further. But even as fear pressed down on her, she found herself thinking of Clara's small, surprised confession at the table the night before, of the strange lightness that had filled her own chest when she finally spoke honestly, after years of careful silence, and she understood that whatever the cost, she could not simply retreat now into the same small, careful shape she had occupied before. "Then I suppose," Eliza said quietly, "I must decide for myself whether the risk is worth taking." She turned and continued across the lawn, her heart hammering with a fear she could not fully suppress, half expecting Priscilla to call out behind her, to summon some other member of the household to physically prevent her from reaching the garden path. But no such call came, and when she glanced back once, she saw only Priscilla standing very still upon the terrace, watching her go, with an expression Eliza could not read, something between fury and, perhaps, a grudging and unwilling respect. She found the Duke a few minutes later, standing near a low stone wall at the edge of the formal garden, examining a climbing rose with the same unhurried attention he had shown the flowers the day before. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression suggested he was not entirely surprised to see her. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I confess I wondered whether our conversation last night might prompt some difficulty for you this morning. Your face tells me it already has." "Your Grace," Eliza said, and she found, standing there in the damp morning air, with her heart still racing from the confrontation with Priscilla, that the words came easier than she expected, perhaps because she understood this might be her only chance to speak them at all. "I have come to ask for a few minutes of your time, on a matter I believe concerns you as much as it concerns me. I must ask first, though, whether the promise you made me last night, that no harm would come to me for speaking honestly, still holds this morning." The Duke's expression grew serious, all traces of polite curiosity replaced by something sharper and more attentive. "It holds, Miss Hartley, and it will continue to hold for as long as I have any influence over the matter. Tell me what has happened." And so, standing beside a stone wall in a garden still wet with morning dew, with the fate of her entire future balanced on the words she chose in the next few minutes, Eliza began to tell the Duke of Ravenwood everything she had overheard the night before, and everything she had learned that very morning, about debts and solicitors, and a plan already set in motion to remove her from the house, before she could speak another honest word to the one man who had asked to hear them. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression growing graver with each detail Eliza offered, and when she finished, he stood silent for a long moment, looking out over the garden with the same unhurried attention he had shown the roses, though Eliza sensed the stillness now hid something far sharper than casual curiosity. "You have taken a considerable risk in telling me this," he said finally. "I imagine you understand that better than most." "I do, Your Grace, but I understood also that if I said nothing, I would be gone from this house before the day was through, and whatever chance I had to speak plainly would be lost along with it." "Then I am glad you chose to take the risk." He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression had shifted from the polite, searching curiosity of the night before, into a quiet, focused intensity that reminded Eliza, briefly and uncomfortably, of a man preparing for battle, rather than a conversation. "I confess, Miss Hartley, that my questions at dinner last night were not entirely idle curiosity. I had already heard certain rumors before I ever arrived at this estate, rumors regarding the Ashcombe family's finances that troubled me enough to alter my travel plans and arrive a day earlier than expected, in the hope of observing the household before any careful preparations could be arranged for my benefit." Eliza absorbed this with a strange mixture of relief and unease. "Then you already suspected something was being hidden from you." "I suspected. I did not know. Your account this morning confirms a great deal more than I had managed to learn through my own inquiries, and it does so at a cost to yourself that I take very seriously." He paused, studying her face with an expression she found difficult to read. "I must ask you directly, Miss Hartley, and I ask you to answer with the same honesty you have shown me already. Do you believe your safety, in the most literal sense, to be genuinely at risk within this household, or do you fear only the loss of your position and the difficulties that would follow from being sent away without proper reference?" It was a careful question, and Eliza understood the importance of answering it precisely. "I do not believe Lord or Lady Ashcombe intend me physical harm, Your Grace, but I overheard enough last night to believe they intend to remove me from this house, today, specifically to prevent me from speaking with you again, and I have no confidence in what protections, if any, would follow me once I am sent to a household I know nothing about, among relations I have never met, entirely beyond the reach of anyone who might otherwise look after my well-being." "That is answer enough," the Duke said grimly. "A young woman with no family connections, dispatched suddenly to an unfamiliar household under circumstances designed specifically to silence her, is not a matter I am willing to treat lightly, whatever assurances Lord Ashcombe might offer regarding his intentions." He fell silent for a moment, and Eliza watched him consider his next move with the same careful deliberation she had seen in him at the dinner table the night before. I intend to speak with Lord Ashcombe directly, he said finally. Not on your behalf alone, though your situation troubles me a great deal, but regarding the full truth of this estate's finances, which I have every right to demand before any further discussion of marriage between our families can reasonably proceed. I would ask you to remain nearby, Miss Hartley, though not present in the room itself, in case I have further questions once the conversation begins. Your Grace, I fear that if Lord Ashcombe learns I have spoken with you already, whatever protection your presence offers me now will vanish the moment your carriage departs this estate. The Duke considered this with visible seriousness. Then I will ensure, before I depart, that any such consequence becomes impossible for him to carry out, without significant cost to himself. I did not offer you my word lightly last night, Miss Hartley, and I do not intend to let circumstance make a liar of me now. They returned to the house together, though the Duke asked Eliza to wait in the small library adjoining Lord Ashcombe's study, while he requested a private audience with the master of the house. Eliza sat in the quiet room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, straining to hear the conversation taking place through the connecting door, though the thick wood muffled most of the words into an indistinct murmur. She heard enough, however, to understand the shape of what unfolded. The Duke's voice, calm but unyielding, laying out plainly what he had learned, both from his own inquiries before arriving at the estate and from the conversation he had just had in the garden. Lord Ashcombe's voice, first defensive, then increasingly strained, attempting explanations that grew thinner with each exchange, and beneath it all, a growing silence that told Eliza more clearly than any words could have that the careful architecture Lady Constance had built around this visit was collapsing entirely. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only 20 minutes, the study door opened, and Lord Ashcombe emerged looking considerably older than he had at breakfast that morning, his face pale and drawn, his earlier confident bearing entirely gone. He glanced toward Eliza with an expression she could not quite name, something between resentment and a kind of weary resignation, before continuing down the hall without a word. The Duke appeared in the doorway a moment later, and though his expression remained composed, Eliza saw something in his eyes that suggested the conversation had cost him something as well, some measure of the easy goodwill he had shown toward the family the night before. Lord Ashcombe has agreed to be entirely truthful regarding the estate's finances, and has agreed further that no harm or hasty departure will be arranged for you, Miss Hartley, so long as I remain in a position to verify your continued welfare, he said. I will not pretend this resolves every difficulty facing this household, nor does it guarantee your comfort here in the months and years ahead, but it removes, I hope, the most immediate danger you described to me this morning. Relief flooded through Eliza so suddenly that she felt momentarily lightheaded, though beneath it, a new and equally pressing worry had already begun to take shape. She had been protected, for now, by the direct intervention of a powerful stranger. But strangers, however well-intentioned, eventually departed, and she would remain in this house long after his carriage had carried him back toward the capital, subject once more to whatever quiet resentments and careful punishments Lady Constance might choose to visit upon her, once his protection no longer hovered so directly over the household. Your Grace, she said carefully, I am deeply grateful for your intervention this morning, but I confess, I do not know what becomes of my position here once you have departed. Lady Ashcombe's displeasure will not simply vanish because you have spoken with her husband. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of thoughtful consideration that Eliza did not fully understand. No, he agreed slowly, it will not. Which is precisely the question I find myself turning over as we speak, Miss Hartley, and one I do not yet have a complete answer to. But I do not intend to leave this estate today without first determining some arrangement that ensures your safety and your welfare extend well beyond the length of my visit. Lady Constance found Eliza less than an hour later, in the small sewing room where Eliza had retreated to steady her nerves after the encounter in the library. She entered without knocking, closing the door firmly behind her, and Eliza rose from her chair immediately, sensing at once that whatever conversation was about to unfold would not be gentle. You went to him, Lady Constance said, her voice low and controlled, in a way that felt far more dangerous than open anger would have. After everything I have done for you these past 6 years, taking you in when you had nowhere else to go, feeding you, clothing you, giving you a place in this household when I owed you nothing at all, you went behind my back to the one man whose good opinion determines my daughter's entire future. My lady, I went to him because I believed I was about to be sent away without warning, to a household I know nothing of, specifically to prevent me from speaking honestly to a man who had asked for my honesty, Eliza replied, and though her voice trembled slightly, she forced herself to hold Lady Constance's gaze, rather than lower her eyes, as she had done so many times before. You are being sent to your cousin's household because your cousin genuinely requires a companion, a fact you would have learned in due course had you simply trusted the arrangements being made on your behalf, as a girl in your position ought to. Eliza said nothing to this, understanding there was little to be gained in arguing the point directly, though she did not believe for a moment that the timing of the arrangement had been coincidental. Lady Constance studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, the controlled anger giving way to something closer to genuine exhaustion. Do you understand what you have done, Eliza? The Duke now believes he has uncovered some grave conspiracy in this household, when in truth, we are simply a family struggling, as many families struggle, to maintain what we have built against difficulties, not entirely of our own making. Whatever arrangement he has extracted from my husband this morning will follow us for years, a debt of obligation to a man who now believes himself entitled to oversee our private affairs. I did not intend to create difficulty for your family, my lady. I intended only to protect myself from a danger I genuinely believed to be real. And did it not occur to you that your safety was never truly in question, that you allowed your imagination to construct a threat where none existed, and in doing so, created exactly the sort of catastrophe you claimed to fear? Lady Constance's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her otherwise careful composure. You have spent 6 years in this house, learning restraint, learning caution, and in a single morning, you abandoned every lesson you had absorbed, all because a powerful stranger showed you a moment's flattering attention at a dinner table. Eliza felt the accusation land somewhere painful and uncertain in her chest, and for a moment, she genuinely questioned whether Lady Constance might be right, whether she had allowed fear and, perhaps, something else entirely, some desperate hope kindled by the Duke's unexpected kindness, to drive her toward actions that had caused more harm than the danger she believed she was escaping. But she thought again of the conversation she had overheard the night before, of the visitor in Lord Ashcombe's study that morning, of the words she had heard through the door with her own ears, and she found her doubt steadying back into certainty. My lady, she said quietly, I heard you say, with my own ears, that you needed to ensure my silence one way or another. I heard Lord Ashcombe's visitor this morning say that I must be dealt with before I could speak to the Duke again, and that I would be sent away that very day. I did not imagine those words. I did not construct a danger from nothing. I responded to precisely what I overheard, and I do not believe, even now, that I was wrong to do so. Lady Constance's composure cracked further at this, and for the first time since Eliza had known her, something like genuine uncertainty flickered across her features, as though she were only now grappling with the reality that her own words, spoken in what she believed to be privacy, had carried consequences she had not fully anticipated. You have made your choice then, Lady Constance said finally, her voice quiet and strangely flat. I hope, for your sake, that it proves the right one, because whatever protection the Duke believes he has secured for you this morning will not last forever, and when it fades, as such arrangements always eventually do, you will still be living under this roof, and I will still remember exactly whose loyalty failed this family when it was tested. She left the room without waiting for a response, and Eliza stood alone in the small sewing room for a long time afterward, her hands trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation, uncertain whether she had won some genuine victory or simply exchanged one form of danger for another, quieter and more patient kind. It was the Duke himself who found her there some time later, knocking softly at the open door before entering, his expression thoughtful and, Eliza thought, somewhat troubled. I have spoken further with Lord Ashcombe, he said, and I have secured certain assurances regarding your position here, though I confess, I share your own doubts about how long such assurances might hold, once genuine distance separates my involvement from this household's daily affairs. He paused, studying her carefully. I find myself considering an alternative, Miss Hartley, one I would not have imagined proposing before last night's dinner, but which now seems to me the more honest path forward. Eliza waited, her heart beginning to quicken again, though this time with something closer to cautious curiosity than fear. My own household in the capital has long required someone capable of managing correspondence and accounts with both discretion and genuine intelligence, qualities I have found in shorter supply than one might expect among the many candidates who have sought such positions over the years. I witnessed both qualities in you last night, and again this morning, in circumstances that would have overwhelmed a great many people far less capable than yourself. He hesitated, and Eliza thought she saw something almost uncertain in his expression, a rare crack in his usual composed bearing. I am offering you a position in my own household, Miss Hartley, one that would remove you entirely from any further danger here, and one that I believe would allow you, for the first time in a great many years, to speak your honest thoughts without fear of the consequences that have followed you in this house. The offer landed with such unexpected weight that Eliza found herself momentarily unable to respond at all, standing in stunned silence as she absorbed the full shape of what he was suggesting, a path forward she had not imagined possible even in her most hopeful moments the night before. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice unsteady, I do not know how to answer such an offer. I have spent 6 years believing my future was already decided for me, shaped entirely by the needs and wishes of this family. I do not quite know how to consider a future shaped instead by my own choice. Then perhaps, the Duke said gently, this is precisely the moment to begin learning. Eliza spent that night the same way she had spent the night before, sitting awake in her narrow room, with a candle burning low, though the thoughts turning over in her mind now carried a very different weight. She thought of the trunk in the corner, the same trunk that had carried her into this house 6 years ago, and imagined it carrying her out again, this time toward a future she had been given some real say in shaping. She thought too of Clara, of the small, surprised confession that had slipped from her at the dinner table, the admission that she wished to play music for love rather than approval. Eliza had spoken to her briefly that afternoon, finding her alone in the music room, and had been surprised to find not resentment in the younger woman's eyes, but something closer to quiet gratitude. I have never been permitted to say such things aloud before, Clara had admitted, her fingers resting lightly on the keys without pressing them. I do not know whether to thank you or resent you for making it possible, but I find I am grateful all the same. I did not mean to speak for you, Eliza had said, only for myself. Perhaps that is exactly why it mattered, Clara replied. I have spent my whole life listening to people speak for me. It was strange, and rather wonderful, to hear someone simply speak the truth and let the rest of us decide what to make of it. Eliza carried that conversation with her into the quiet hours of the night, turning it over alongside everything else that had happened in the space of 2 extraordinary days. She thought of Mrs. Whitfield's warning, offered with such careful concern, and of the promise she had made to come to her if danger arose. She thought of Aunt Priscilla's cold threats on the lawn, and of Lady Constance's final words in the sewing room, a warning wrapped in exhaustion that Eliza suspected she would carry with her regardless of where her future led. And she thought of the Duke's offer, extended so unexpectedly, a chance to build a life shaped by her own choices, rather than the careful, fearful calculations of a household desperate to preserve its own reputation. By morning, she had made her decision, though she carried it to Mrs. Whitfield first, needing to speak it aloud to someone who had shown her genuine kindness before she could fully believe it herself. You would leave everything you know, Mrs. Whitfield said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of what Eliza was considering, for a position in a household you have never seen, under the protection of a man you met only 2 days ago. I would leave a household where I have spent 6 years learning to make myself smaller, Eliza replied, for the chance to discover what I might become if I were finally permitted to take up my full space in the world. Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, and something like pride, quiet and unspoken, softened the lines of her weathered face. Then I think you have already answered your own question, child, and I think your mother, wherever she is, would be very proud of the woman standing before me now. The carriage that carried Eliza away from Ashcombe Manor departed 2 days later, on a morning bright with unexpected sunshine, after the rain that had marked her final dinner in that house. Lady Constance did not come to see her off, though Clara appeared briefly at the door, pressing a small book of music into Eliza's hands, with a whispered word of thanks that carried more warmth than anything Eliza had heard from her in 6 years of careful, distant courtesy. Lord Ashcombe offered a stiff, formal farewell, that acknowledged nothing of the difficult conversations that had passed between them, though Eliza thought she saw, beneath his careful composure, something that might have been a grudging respect for the courage she had shown, however inconvenient it had proven to his own plans. The journey to the capital took the better part of 2 days, and Eliza spent much of it looking out the carriage window at a landscape unfolding before her that felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, genuinely open with possibility, rather than narrowed by careful limitation. She thought of everything that had happened since that midnight carriage arrived at Ashcombe Manor, the fear, the danger, the desperate calculations of a family trying to protect what they had built, and the strange, unexpected courage that had carried her through moments she would once have believed entirely beyond her capacity to survive. She arrived at the Duke's household to find a staff considerably smaller and less formal than Ashcombe Manor's, and a household manager who greeted her with genuine warmth rather than the careful, appraising coolness Lady Constance had always shown new arrivals. The Duke himself met her in the front hall, and something in his expression suggested a man genuinely pleased to see his offer accepted, rather than simply satisfied at having secured a capable employee. "I confess I was not entirely certain you would come," he admitted, as a footman carried her modest trunk toward the rooms she had been assigned. 6 years of caution do not unlearn themselves easily, even in the face of genuine opportunity. "I very nearly did not," Eliza admitted honestly, "but I found, in the end, that I could not return to being the woman who sat silent at that table, not after learning what it felt like to speak and be heard." In the months that followed, Eliza settled into her new position, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, managing correspondence and accounts with the same careful attention she had once devoted to smoothing over the small crises of Ashcombe Manor, though now her opinions were sought rather than merely tolerated, her judgment trusted rather than constantly second-guessed. She wrote occasionally to Clara, who had begun, in small and careful ways, to insist on choices of her own within the confines of her mother's household, and she received word, some months later, that Lord Ashcombe's finances had been placed under careful and legitimate management, the debts addressed honestly rather than concealed behind careful performances for wealthy visitors. She thought often, in quiet moments, of the woman she had been on that rainy midnight when the carriage first arrived at Ashcombe Manor, folded so carefully into corners, trained to believe that silence was both her duty and her only protection. She did not entirely regret those years, understanding that they had taught her patience and careful observation, qualities that had served her well when the moment finally came to speak. But she understood now, with a clarity that had taken 6 long years and 1 extraordinary dinner to achieve, that silence had never truly been safety. It had only ever been a smaller kind of danger, one that asked nothing of her but her own diminishment in exchange for a fragile and conditional welcome. And she understood, standing now in a household where her voice was genuinely wanted rather than merely permitted, that the moment a stranger had turned to her at a candlelit table and asked her to speak first, he had given her something far more valuable than protection or opportunity. He had given her permission to finally become herself, and in accepting it, she had discovered a courage she had carried within her all along, simply waiting for someone to ask the right question at exactly the right moment, and for her to find, at last, the strength to answer it honestly.